Welcome, class, to this extra large size, probably couple day presentation on how the West was won and then lost, myths and history on the American Western frontier. Now, this is quite an abrupt break from where we have been talking about the Civil War most recently. And we're not really doing a lecture just on Reconstruction, which would be the next chapter in the textbook. That's still going to be important information. But ever since coming to Oklahoma and teaching a first course on American Western frontier, I thought this should be more part of our general survey of American history. Um, we've got to include a little bit more about the history of the West, the Trans-Mississippi West, and Oklahoma would be included in that as well. So I've put together this presentation that'll probably take a couple of our class periods here to get through how the West was won and then lost. Now, for starters here, we're going to be looking at some pictures and see if you can identify any of these. This might be like an experience of watching Blues Clues when I say, do you see pictures behind me? And then I give a long, awkward pause and wait for you to respond. Never really one of my favorite children's programs there, to be honest. Blues Clues or anything else that waited for an audience to respond. To me, that just seemed like laziness on the part of writers who couldn't fill enough time. Well, I don't want to be accused of the same, so I will fill the time here. These are images of some stars of Western movies or television shows. Do you know any of these names? Well, probably you're most likely to know the most recent ones at the bottom. This is Clint Eastwood, who, of course, now is famous Hollywood director, producer. You know, every movie he does is a box office smash, and it is certainly critically acclaimed. But early in his career, it was mainly Western movies that caught people's attention. And so this is a picture of him. I believe this is probably from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Still a classic in Western movies. Now, if you know anyone else on here, the one you probably should know the most is here on the bottom left. This is a painting of John Wayne, who made so many movies, dozens and dozens of movies, many of them set in the West, um, from the 1920s and 30s all the way to the early 1970s before he passed away. Now, I grew up watching The Lone Ranger on television. Yes, they were all in black and white. No, those were not new when I was watching them. I was watching reruns, but still, I liked the whole adventure there of this mysterious Lone Ranger and his Native American friend named Tonto. I really liked Tonto's paint horse even better than the solid white horse of Silver, which was the horse of the Lone Ranger. Um, there was a movie made not too long ago about that. I say not too long, could be 10 years, but a more modern rendition of the Lone Ranger has come up. And then on the top left, you have to go all the way back to the silent film era. Um, and so, if some of you have visited the Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City, you may be familiar with Tom Mix. He's featured there. But really, these are all just images to show that the West has been with us in our popular imagination for a long time. It's been part of our films and TV shows, and oftentimes people take these movies and that kind of becomes their image of what reality really was. Well, because Western history is so dominated by myths, I thought I would use this theme to try to hopefully teach you something significant about history as well. There's a lot of myths that often cloud our vision about the realities of what happened in the American West. And the myths have often changed. Um, when my grandparents were in school, and that seems like a long time ago to me, but in the whole scheme of American history, it wasn't really that long ago. In the earlier 20th century, if they were sitting in schools like most American school children, 1920s and 30s, what would they be hearing about the American West? What would they be hearing about people migrating west and confrontations with Native Americans? Well, first of all, they probably wouldn't really use the term Native Americans. They would use the word Indians and not think anything of it, not think that there's something politically incorrect about using that term. The stories they would hear, what they would learn in a history class, most likely would be something like this: that the United States expanded and its great population of great individualists and great innovators spread across the continent, and thank goodness they did, because they brought with them civilization, they brought with them improvement, and Native Americans were really a primitive kind of people, often a very savage kind of people. And thank goodness the United States spread across all of that land and helped tame it. It won the West, and we're all better off for it. That might be something like the overall narrative that you would have learned in the early 20th century. A lot of Indian wars had just really finished up about a generation earlier. And so the view would not have been one that was very sympathetic to Native Americans. Things have changed now, though, in the early 21st century and the late 20th century, in fact. Probably you may have heard some things almost just the opposite of what my grandparents would have learned in school. We're much more likely now to hear of a tragic migration of Europeans across the continent. Maybe even that it was tragic that they ever landed in North America to begin with. But all of the migration westward and the Indian confrontations, now we're more likely to hear that these were genocidal attempts to eradicate Indians, and that it's really the American citizens who were the savages. The Indians, well, they were noble, um, peaceful people who are in tune with nature. And here come these greedy, land hungry Americans who are intent on stealing their land and abusing them, and in some cases, trying to wipe them out. Very unjustified. Well, my point here today is that both of those versions of Western history are very distorted and just based on myth, maybe some version of the truth, but certainly not to be accepted as the truth in itself. And that's often the way it is in history. We tend to gravitate toward simplistic stories. It's all, very black and white, or in this case, maybe red and white. It's all very simplistic, but history is definitely not simple. History is very complicated. It's very complex because it deals with human beings, and humans are very complex. So I'm going to try to complicate this story for you a little bit as we look at several episodes of confrontation between Americans and Native Americans, or American citizens and the American Indian. And we're going to see that it is quite a complicated story. It's not exactly what my grandparents would have heard, and it's not exactly probably what you have been hearing either, if you're hearing a very simplistic story here. We're going to talk about how the West was won and then lost in a very complicated kind of way. And it's going to take us a little while to get there. So, for starters, let's talk about um, changes in U.S. policy toward Native Americans. Now, we haven't really directly addressed U.S. Indian relations since we talked about Indian removal in Andrew Jackson's day. Back then, Indians were being um, strongly encouraged, coerced into moving beyond the Mississippi River because it seemed that the United States was populating everything east of the Mississippi River, and it would take them many generations before they're really ready to cross the Mississippi and move much more into lands that had been purchased in the Louisiana Purchase and beyond. But of course, we know things sped up quite a bit as far as territorial expansion in the 1830s and 40s. The United States did not take generations and generations to spread across the continent. Thanks to its natural growth and thanks to immigration and thanks to a gold rush in California, there were lots and lots of people heading west. And that meant confrontation with some Native Americans. Some Native Americans who had lived way west and never really had contact with Americans before, and some native groups who had just recently been pushed to the west. Well, we're going to be looking especially at the 1860s and 70s when the government is going to change its policies. Instead of just encouraging Indians to move to the west, now they're going to be encouraging Indians to accept life on reservations. Don't just live anywhere beyond the Mississippi River and roam freely. The United States government really starts to push for Indians to accept living on smaller plots of land, a reservation, so they would not harass American settlers moving west, whether it's on a wagon train or actually building a locomotive railroad train. U.S. government was pushing the issue of reservations, trying to get Indian tribes to accept reservations. But of course, Indian tribes are going to resist this policy as well. So this is taking place in the 1860s, and we'll look at a few examples of the confrontation, the resistance that was put up against this new reservation system. Well, one example would be Kit Carson and his fight against the Navajos. Now, Kit Carson's an interesting character to use because here's a person that there's a lot of myth surrounding anyway. Kit Carson was a celebrity. He was already a well-known legend in his time, much like Davy Crockett or Daniel Boone. These outdoor Western figures who already have exaggerated stories being told about them and books written about them or magazines and something kind of like comic books almost written about these real life men with a lot of exaggerated tales about their lives and exploits. Well, Kit Carson was a fur trapper. He was a mountain man. So he had guided many people and he had gone on his own to hunt for animals in the West. He had lived much like many Native American people lived, just living off the land because that was his livelihood. Well, he had also, as I said, guided some U.S. forces deep through the mountains, through the Rocky Mountains, which he knew very well. And he had traveled all over the Pacific Northwest, down into California, and a part the Southwest. He had really traveled and hunted and trapped as big a distance as just about anyone in his day. Well, in 1860-61, he was employed by the U.S. military to try to get the Navajo tribe of Arizona, they live in Arizona and New Mexico, get them to accept the reservation life, force them to move on to a reservation, and they're fighting against it. Well, Kit Carson did not hate Native Americans. He did not despise all Native Americans. In fact, he marries a couple of different Indian women and lives a lifestyle much like Native Americans would live, married to more than one person at a time. He doesn't really live exactly by the conventions of American society. But when it came to fighting, he was going to be vicious in taking the fight to the Navajos. In fact, his main way of fighting the Navajos was going to be make war on their um, um, their way of life and their ability to feed themselves, and they will have to surrender. So Kit Carson goes into an area called Canyon de Chelly that is in northeastern Arizona. It's a really, really beautiful, deep canyon. If there wasn't already a Grand Canyon, this um, might be named that because there's 1,000-foot drops, just cliff drops that go straight down. Um, Really a fabulous canyon and a great remote place for Navajo to hide. But Kit Carson had gone in, destroyed much of the crops that they had counted on, subsisting on for the next season. And he knew by destroying their crops, they're going to have to surrender. Now, this is 1861, and this is the same kind of thing that General Sherman will use when he's marching through Georgia and South Carolina. If you destroy everything those people in Georgia and South Carolina depend on, they will have to surrender. That's what Kit Carson does here. But it's not out of some animosity. It's not because he wants the genocide of all Native Americans. He's employed by the U.S. military, and he is going to do his job with ruthless efficiency. Now, when the Navajos do surrender and they are moved to the reservation, tragically for them, the reservation is not very well supplied. The U.S. does not do a very good job making sure everyone's going to move there safely, and there's going to be plenty of food and plenty of supplies, and they'll be just as well off as when they were living freely by themselves. No, the reservation system uh, leaves much to be desired. But again, it's not always the fault of the warrior. It's not Kit Carson's design that many of them die in reservations. It's poor management of the reservations and poor funding from the federal government. But keep in mind, there is this civil war going on at the same time as well. What's happening in a Navajo reservation was not the top priority of Abraham Lincoln in the early stages of the Civil War. So there's one episode. Tragic, yes. Not an attempt to wipe out a race, though. Now, another episode happens just the following year, 1862, and this is in another part of the West, really far north in Minnesota, and really just across the Mississippi River. From where we are, we might not think of it as very far west, but it is across the Mississippi, right at the Mississippi's headwaters in Minnesota. So the Sioux Nation is really a large Indian nation, has many different branches. And this is one branch who had already accepted reservation life. They've sold or given away most of their land and made agreements with the United States that they would live on their reservation, and the United States is going to supply them with some money, with some blankets, with some food every year. That's part of the deal. But things were not very well supplied at this reservation either. And the Sioux were complaining that they don't have enough blankets, they don't have enough to eat. They go to the Indian agent that was assigned there. He was someone who worked for the federal government, but was the point person to um, talk to the Native Americans in that region. They go to this Indian agent and complain about their lack of food, and he has a very calloused response. He tells them ultimately if they don't have food, they could eat grass or dung. They can eat animal droppings. Not a very nice thing to say, not very, not very compassionate. This is one man working for the um, Indian Affairs, Indian Agency. Um, but here's a lot of tension between the United States and this tribe that's getting very upset. They're not um, they're not enjoying isn't really the right word, but they're not um, living through reservation life quite the way that they had imagined. Well, it's in this context that there's a group of young men from this tribe who are practicing the arts of war. You know, they're throwing the tomahawks and they're shooting arrows, and they start to taunt one another. Maybe you've seen something like this. A group of young men sometimes do very foolish things that individually they would know not to get into. But when they get in a group, somehow um, really poor decisions get made collectively. I'm not sure why that happens. Guys, there maybe one of you knows a secret. When we're in a group, why does the IQ seem to go down? Well, there may be some alcohol involved here as well, but this small group of young warriors start taunting one another. You know, you're afraid of the white man. No, I'm not afraid of the white man. Well, if we're not afraid of the white man, why don't we go and confront them right over there? You know, there's some scattered settlers living nearby, near where they're testing the arts of war. And they go to this isolated farmhouse to prove that they're not afraid. And they confront this white settler family. Well, they kill the husband and wife and children of this family. And they head back to the tribe, probably sobering up as they arrive as well. And they let the tribe know what they've done. Well, this put the chief of this tribe um, in a real dilemma. You know, he's had his name was Little Crow. He knows this is a real dilemma because if they just confess, if they come forward and say to Minnesota territory authorities, some of our young men killed a settler family. They shouldn't have done it, but you know, boys will be boys. What are you going to do? Well, those young men will be executed, almost certainly. They're not just going to be forgiven, it's going to be an eye for an eye. They will be killed. So there are the chief of this tribe is really in a dilemma. And there are members of that tribe who say, these boys were right anyway. We should confront our white neighbors. We should fight because they're not doing what they said they were going to do anyway with our reservation. So Little Crow is really in a tight position here. And by the way, native tribes did not really have such a government that said, whatever the chief says, everyone has to obey. No, they're much more free individually than American citizens were. Um, the chief can't stop someone from going and fighting. Now, he may reprimand them, may not be real happy, but there's a number of people among the Sioux that said, let's just fight. Well, Little Crow knew that's probably suicide. If we go to war with these Americans, they can wipe us out. But if that's what the tribe's going to do, he'll join. So for a little while in 1862, there's a great Sioux uprising, and they go not just to one isolated farmhouse, but to many. And they're wiping out men, women, and children. Over 800 people they kill. Now, Minnesota almost clears out um, of settlers. People are fleeing the territory, or they're just joining a militia ready to fight and regain their homes. But this is no Disney movie here. This is no Pocahontas. This is vicious, violent war. People aren't dying in just, nice sleepy ways to fall asleep and never wake up again. People are scalped. Children are nailed to trees and their stomachs are cut open so animals can come and feed on them. It is vile. It's the West, the real West. Could be a very rough place. Well, eventually, there's enough American soldiers and militia to fight back and suppress this great Sioux uprising. And there are people, settlers in Minnesota, that want to see a bunch of people killed because, of course, 800 of their own have been killed. Abraham Lincoln, though he's still president here, this is 1862, thought there shouldn't be such a mass execution of you know, a whole bunch of this tribe. They narrow down who they think are the ringleaders of this war, and they try and execute 36 people, 36 or 38 people um, at once. A giant hanging of 36 people. That's still the largest mass execution in American history. But there were other people in Minnesota that thought this should be hundreds, not dozens of people. Now, that was a complicated episode because the Sioux had a right to be upset. The reservation system wasn't really working for them. And yet, many settlers die who really had nothing to do with how the Sioux were going to be fed and supplied. Well, a couple of years later, there's another terrible tragedy. This one involves the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in Colorado. Okay, it's still Civil War time, 1864, but people in Colorado were mainly fighting Native Americans there that are resisting the reservation system. The Cheyenne tribe, well, they roam all over the Great Plains, very far, much further north than Colorado and much further south as well. They don't want any government policy that now tells them they have to be confined to one plot of land. Even if it's a pretty big plot, it's nowhere near how far they roam chasing buffalo, subsisting off of the buffalo. So there was already a war going on between the Cheyenne and American settlers moving into Colorado. Mainly, they've come because there's um, another gold and silver rush along Pikes Peak. This is what's populating new towns like Denver. Well, um, this war had gone on for a long time, and one of the main militia fighters was a man named John Chivington. That's Chivington with a CH, Chivington, Chivington. John Chivington was once a Methodist minister. Now he's turned Indian fighter, and he's determined to subdue the Cheyenne. And for a little while, he had some U.S. military with him. Normally, it's just him and voluntary militia. But Chivington had some U.S. troops with him and wanted to make good use of them. Well, meanwhile, a Cheyenne leader named Black Kettle had given up the fight. Now, not all Cheyenne, but Black Kettle's band decided we can no longer keep fighting and running. There's too many of us dying. We're going to give up. And so they had turned themselves in at a fort, and soldiers at the fort had said, okay, you can camp outside the fort. You'll be okay. We'll work out the terms of the surrender soon. But John Chivington takes his men and some U.S. military and charges into the Indian camp, Black Kettle's camp, at Sand Creek. This is eastern part of Colorado, not the most mountainous, prettiest part. John Chivington still charges into the Indian camp while they're trying to communicate, we've surrendered. We're done fighting. Shivington keeps on coming and keeps on coming. And they're going to kill, I forget the exact number, over 150 people at Sand Creek, many of them women and children, because many of the men were actually out searching for food or gathering supplies. This is really not just a war against soldiers and warriors. There's a lot of women and children killed here. And when people all over the United States read about this, because Eastern newspapers are going to talk about this, many are appalled. Many are so upset that U.S. soldiers were used in this way to kill innocent Indian women and children. John Shivington is condemned by a lot of people in the East. Not so much in the West, though. John Shivington becomes a hero to people in Colorado. For those that are still living in the midst of Indian War, they don't see this nearly as much as a tragedy. They see it as a victory. They know some of their own people having already been killed in this Cheyenne War, or they've read about the Great Sioux Uprising, and they feel the threat. So Shivington is a hero in Colorado. When he goes to the Denver Opera House, he holds up this string of scalps that were taken at Sand Creek. Yes, the war is vicious there too. They will take scalps, they'll take other body parts that will decorate parts of their hat, rings around their hat. And the people at the Denver Opera House stand up and cheer. They give him a standing ovation. Now, I probably wouldn't get that in New York City or Philadelphia, but it's been centuries since their last Indian War, too. So here's another complicated, tragic part of the story, the Sand Creek Massacre. John Shivington explained that the reason he kills Indian children was because in his mind, nits make lice. Something that's just a little bug now is later going to be a bigger bug and a nuisance. John Shivington did hate Indians, but his is not the view of all Americans everywhere. It was a common view in some parts, especially people living in the West, experiencing these confrontations. But it's not the view of all Americans everywhere. Well, we could get to some stories where Native Americans have more success. Red Cloud was another Sioux warrior, but not in Minnesota. This is more in like present day Montana. And Red Cloud was very successful at fighting settlers moving into his land. In fact, he made it so difficult for people moving further up the Bozeman Trail. He convinced the U.S. to stop building forts along that Bozeman Trail, withdraw. So, we could say Red Cloud was very successful. He actually turns the United States back, and they decide, let's quit going deeper and deeper into Montana. Let's leave that area alone. But in part of the negotiations and talking with Red Cloud, Red Cloud is brought for a tour in the East. And this is something that would happen quite commonly if U.S. officials could convince a Native American, one of their chiefs, if they could convince them, come to the East, come see the rest of our land and our people. It always left an enormous impression. And it certainly does with Red Cloud as well. Imagine here's a man, a warrior who's lived off the land, lived in the Great Plains and in the mountains. He understands how to live off the land, how to chase buffalo, how to make a whole life from what resources are given to you in the West. But he's never really seen a city. And for him to tour part of the East, for him to see the nation's capital, or let's say he sees Philadelphia, New York City, if he sees some of these places where now there are as many as 1 million people living in one place, it will blow his mind. And that's the intent. That's what's supposed to happen. Red Cloud will come back from this trip, even after he's been successful defending his land. He's going to come back to his tribe and say, we must negotiate with these people. There's too many of them. What we're seeing coming into Montana, coming into their area, is just a fraction. It's just a trickle of settlers coming in. But the Americans are numbered in the millions. You know, the Sioux are a big tribe because they can be numbered in the thousands. But there's no way they win an ongoing struggle with the United States. So Red Cloud comes back and says, we better take the best deal that we can get from them, because our way of life will be changing. Well, when chiefs come back and talk like this, you know, younger warriors think they've been brainwashed. Our chief has been brainwashed by these, you know, these white people. Red Cloud's not brainwashed. He's just seen the future. He's seen reality, and the reality is there's too many Americans that are going to be moving into this area, and they cannot resist forever, or they'll be wiped out. So Red Cloud, another interesting, complex figure here, successful in battle, but later knows they must accept reservation life because change is coming. Well, 1876, this brings us to an interesting turning point in American history because it's the 100-year anniversary of there being a United States. And it's also the time of a famous Indian battle, the Battle of Little Bighorn, or sometimes known as Custer's Last Stand, because there's a Colonel George Armstrong Custer that is killed in this battle. Well, Custer, pictured here, Custer had actually risen to the rank of a general during the Civil War. He was the youngest Union general and had far surpassed his performance at West Point. He was one of the lowest West Point graduates, almost kicked out of school, but you know, behaved himself just well enough to stay in school and finish. But because of his bravery in the war and his aggressiveness in war, he rose through the ranks and became a general and a great cavalry leader in the Civil War. But after the war, there's not as much of a need for that many generals, that many colonels. So he is demoted, but it wasn't anything about his service that got him demoted. But after the Civil War, he continued to serve the U.S. military in the West and involved in some of these Indian conflicts. In fact, I mentioned Black Kettle, someone whose tribe was decimated by this Sand Creek massacre. Well, Black Kettle actually survives. He's one of the men who's not there when they're attacked. And Black Kettle and his people will end up living in Oklahoma. They'll be in Indian territory along the Ouachita River. But some of those reservation Indians in Oklahoma would cross the border, go into Texas, raid people there, and then back to the safety of the reservation. That happened a few times, and so Custer was finally sent in to teach these reservation Indians a lesson. Now, the question is, was he attacking the right group of Indians? Was he really hitting the culprits who were using Oklahoma just as a safe ground from which to launch their raids? Probably not. but he invades Black Kettle's band and kills many of the Indians there in this thing that's called the Battle of the Washita. Really, not so much of a battle, more of a massacre at the Washita River. Um, Ironically, Black Kettle is killed in this raid, while he's on reservation, as opposed to at the Great Sioux, at the Sand Creek massacre. So Custer already had a reputation for being an Indian fighter, um, being very tough. And so he was a person that was going to be picked to face Indians in this confrontation at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Now, the context here was um, Indians in the Black Hills of South Dakota, parts of Montana. Many of them have gotten very upset and left the reservations because people are moving into their land. White settlers started to come into their land because they've heard reports that there is gold in them their hills. So Native Americans say, Americans have already broken this this agreement. This is supposed to be our land forever, as long as the grass grows. That's what the treaty says. Why are settlers coming in to our land? Here's another complication that that was a constant in U.S. Indian relations. Now, even back to George Washington's time, Washington would hope to keep Americans out of Indian lands, but the uh, the United States never really had the ability or the willingness to truly enforce protection of Indian lands. It would mean killing of a lot of American settlers who still want to move into those lands. So imagine this, 1870s, what politician is going to say, we will set up soldiers and we will shoot you if you're trying to move into Sioux lands along the Black Hills? What politician is going to do that? We will kill American citizens in order to preserve Indian lands. No politician's going to do that. No, the easier thing to do, and what the United States almost always ended up doing, was renegotiate with the Indians. Something of value has been found on Indian lands. So now let's renegotiate with the Indians, give them a little more or push them further west, because we cannot or we will not truly keep American citizens out of Indian lands. Well, this is where Custer comes in. Indians, um, many Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, are upset that people are moving into their reservation lands, and so they're ready to fight. And Custer was coming in to give them that fight and push them back to the reservation. Trouble was, Custer was overconfident. He believed that his cavalry could defeat any number of Indians. He's already done it before, but he believed, if he's got hundreds of cavalry with him, there's no number of Indians that could stop him. Well, he divides his force. He had something like 600, and when he divides up the group, he'll end up with about 270 something cavalrymen. And he's got Indian scouts. Here's another complication to the story. The U.S. often had Indians working for them. Some tribes thought we're better off working with the U.S. and serving as spies or scouts. We'll tell you where that other tribe is. So Custer has Indian scouts, and they had scouted the area, and they come back to tell him there is a huge number of warriors over this crest down in that valley. I've never seen so many warriors. Well, Custer doesn't really heed the warning. He's afraid some of them might get away. What he wants to do is take his 270 some odd cavalrymen and go and push these Indians back to the reservation, go whip them. But in fact, his 270 something armed men on horseback, they faced 2,500 angry armed Indians on horseback too. And they're all wiped out. All of Custer's men, including Custer, are killed. The Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand. It was the worst defeat of the United States versus Indians since the 1790s. There was actually a much larger one there early in U.S. history under while George Washington was still president. But it's been that long since the United States has lost to an Indian force like this. This entire regiment wiped out. Well, this is a turning point because now there's going to be more sympathy with Custer and the soldiers and not with the Indians. The Indians are victorious here. They're not going to be the ones sympathized with. Now, there were certainly critics of Custer, even in 1876. Some people thought, well, he was foolish to have charged in. Other people thought, this guy has always kind of been about himself and self-promotion. He's hoping to win more political points. He was a Democrat and not a real supporter of President Ulysses S. Grant. So there are some that thought, well, he's trying to make a name for himself so he could challenge Grant for the presidency. He could possibly be that famous on the Democratic side. But while there was criticism of Custer, there's going to be a lot of sympathy as well. And people will talk about this tragic loss of American soldiers, American cavalrymen at the hands of Native Americans. We'll pause our story for here and pick up more with how the West was won and then lost next time.